Good morning or good evening everybody. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. For this week's video I would like to present another custom layout design. Just like the last one, it is for a multi-deck layout in HO scale. And in this particular case the layout space is somewhat challenging. Here is a scale drawing of most of the client's basement. The maximum space available for the railroad is approximately 22 feet by 15, although there are a lot of obstructions. Here is a very out of scale drawing that the customer sent me before I started. The proportions are a little off. We see that there's a ping pong table in the center occupying most of it. He also has floor cabinets around the entire area that's going to be occupied by the railroad, and he has wall cabinets in this corner which he's not prepared to get rid of. He said all the cabinets have to stay because the room is used as a storage space for the rest of his family. Anyway, this was the second attempt to get everything the right size because the first time I misinterpreted his directions. And this is the main reason why I always send my customers a scale drawing right off the bat, even if they start by sending me what they think is an accurate drawing. I will always completely redraw it, check all the measurements, and ask them if it's correct. And as if to underline just how challenging this plan was going to be, it turned out that I am not the first professional designer he employed for this space. There was already a layout of his own design in this area, which he wasn't happy with. And he showed me a design from another professional designer. I'm not going to mention any names. I don't recall the date on it, but it was a couple of years before he first contacted me. And he was very dissatisfied with that design. Not only were the curves too sharp and the maximum train length too short, but all the switching areas were smushed together, and it would have been totally impossible to come up with any kind of realistic operation. Anyway, here is another drawing of his basement with the remainder of the obstacles drawn in. He sent me some photographs, and on the photographs I saw that not only is there some wall cabinets in this corner, but there's also a box-like soffit at about the same elevation, which I suspect is hiding pipes or air ducts or something of that nature. Now, very early on in the development of the plan, the customer decided that he wanted 3 decks. And this was always going to be challenging, bearing in mind that I can't go as low as I would like to for a 3-deck layout because I have 32-inch high base cabinets under the entire area of the layout. And also with the minimum radius that was going to work for his choice of cars and locomotives, you see that the ping pong table is very cramped. And I pointed this out to him and he said it was okay. He's told me to go ahead, use his footprint, and he'll make do with the amount of space around the ping pong table. This plan also demonstrates that he's going to have to lose some of his base cabinets because they extend into areas which need to be kept open for access inside the helix. These red ovals are what I consider to be the minimum acceptable access opening inside a helix of this size. Note how in both cases he needs to lose about 20 inches of base cabinet under both ends. And yes, in theory it looks like the same size opening could be moved forward in front of the cabinets, but then you end up with a large area at the back of the helix that is not accessible. Bearing in mind, of course, that this is going to be a multi-deck layout with minimal reaching clearance between the decks. Anyway, after a little thought, he understood where I was coming at, and he got permission from his family to shorten the base cabinet slightly at both ends. Now, he wanted to use helix kits from a manufacturer whose name escapes me at the moment, and this shows how much space is necessary to use their 26-inch radius helix. The deck is 5 inches wide, and the supports need at least another inch outside of that. So it needs a little more space than if you was building it from scratch. On the plus side, however, it means that on the top lap of the helix, you have slightly more scenery space in front of the track. There was some talk briefly of using a 30-inch radius. And here is what the layout looks like if we go with the 30-inch helix. As you can see, there is barely even space to squeeze around the end of the ping pong table, never mind actually have a game. So we abandoned that idea and went back to the 26-inch radius, where it is still plenty tight enough. So now the extremities of the benchwork footprint has been finalized. Let's see what's possible to fit into that space. Now this is what we came up with for the lower deck. This is not entirely my design. The idea of the diamond crossing when the two stub-ended staging yards wrapping around the ends was actually the customer's suggestion. And since he didn't want to give up the whole of the lower deck for staging, he wanted 3 scenic decks. It seemed like this was going to be the best option we were ever going to get. It's certainly not ideal. I didn't see any way of improving it. Fortunately, he didn't want to cater for a huge roster of cars and locomotives. He felt that just a few staging tracks at each end of the main line was sufficient. And he was quite happy with muzzle loading, stub end staging, where he needs to back the trains out between sessions to turn them round. And then this continuous cut-off along the front during serious operation represents a pair of interchange tracks, one at each end of the main line. And note how on this lower deck the switching areas are confined to the ends of the layout, which keeps them as far away as possible from the switching areas on the other decks, helping to minimize operator congestion. Here is the initial sketch for the second deck, and at this point we were still thinking about having a decent sized main yard, although we eventually ended up reducing the scope of the main yard significantly. So I've put a second switching area here in the form of an industrial park over this helix, because with the wall cabinets where they are, clearly this end of the room is not going to be available on the third deck. The upper deck has to stop at this point. At the east end of the plan, however, the helix will continue up to the third deck. This is what I initially drew for the top deck. Note how here approximately half the trackage is narrow gauge. It's not as extensive as the narrow gauge he was hoping for, but there really wasn't room to get in any more. So with the basic concept of the railroad set, let's look how I managed to get these concepts to work. Going back to the lower deck now, the customer gave me a list of the types of industries he wanted to represent each town, and I was able to get those in more or less the way he asked for. I moved a few of them as necessary, but most of them were exactly what he wanted. Note how each of these two towns are fairly limited in scope. I've just got a basic passing siding and 3 or 4 spurs at each end. And at this point, I wasn't sure whether I was going to be able to get the staging yard underneath the helix at this end. At the west side of the room, it wasn't going to be a problem because the helix was going to be a good distance around the first lap before crossing over the staging yard. But at this end, it had to go the other way, and I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to get enough clearance here. So at this point, it looked as though the staging yard was going to be rather on the short side, unless I extended the track all the way around the curve and went with a straight ladder, which would have severely restricted the scene at this point. Now for access, the idea is that the backdrop wraps around behind the staging yard instead of in front of it, and then there is low scenery and perhaps a tree line of fairly small trees, high enough to hide the trains from a seated position for operation, but low enough that one can still stand up and easily look over the scenery and see what's going on in there. And because of the limited separation between decks, I suggested that we terrace them. Note how the backdrop has been brought forward on the lower deck, and the upper 2 decks, the fascia is cut back a few inches. It does mean that we end up with less scenery on each deck, but it's a compromise that the customer was willing to accept in order to get his 3 decks in. Here is the middle deck with the tracks drawn in a little more accurately. I've actually given up on putting an access space at the back of this blob at this end, but I have made sure that all the turnouts are grouped towards the front, and by the time the track gets into difficult to reach locations, it is at least fairly straight, and we can make use of automatic uncoupling. And obviously structures that go back there will have to be built off the benchwork and then put in place standing on a short step ladder so as to be able to reach in, which would of course be the same solution for reaching the occasional derailed car. As I mentioned earlier, we have cut down the scope of the main yard somewhat. He wanted a big industry here. He decided on a lumber mill, which was going to be fed by the short line and the narrow gauge feeder on the upper deck. but he did want some servicing facilities for the short lines locomotive fleet. Now note how I haven't tried to fit in any more operational features at the east end of the room, partially because I wanted to keep this space open for operators on the lower deck, and also because this area on this deck and the one above were likely to be the scenic highlights of the railroad. So moving now to the upper deck, I've sketched in a possible standard narrow gauge interchange area. And he decided he wanted the Walters Valley Cement as one of his big industries, and I thought it'd be interesting to put it on this top deck and have that as another multi-gauge industry, with the narrow gauge feeding the raw materials and the standard gauge shipping the finished product. And although he liked that idea, he wanted more than just the one narrow gauge town, and as a result we weren't able to keep that. Here is the middle deck redrawn with the Walters Valley Cement as the main industry in this area. He wanted a variety of different size industries here. I've got one medium industry at the back and two small industries sharing the same spur just in front of it. And to complete Valley Cement as a big industry, we decided that we were going to have a concrete pipe manufacturer as a subsidiary. And now with this industry moved to the middle deck, it opens up a whole load of extra space on the upper deck to have an additional narrow gauge town before the narrow gauge disappears into staging. And with the smaller curves possible on the 3-foot gauge, I can squeeze it back just enough to allow the standard gauge branch to curve round in front of it, leaving most of the top lap of the helix visible. Also note on this top deck plan, I've shown the setback of the 3 decks. Each level set back 6 inches from the previous one. Obviously I can't do that where the helixes go, but I have around the rest of it. Now at this point the customer started to get really excited. He was over the moon that I had been able to fit his seemingly impossible criteria into a very limited space, and he asked me to finish this design. So here is the lower deck in its final form. There were a few upgrades that he asked for on the previous plan. Firstly was the oil dealer in this town. He wanted to know if it could be a full service fuel dealer with a coal trestle and a loading dock as well, and I was able to achieve that. What I did was to move the main line and passing siding further back so that I could extend this track at a slight angle and add some extra length so that the front half of it can still be used as a team track. Now most of the turnouts are Pico number 6s. I did use a few number 8s, especially where the main line has to go through the curved route, and down here there are 2 number 7 curved turnouts. Also the entire ladder for both staging yards is done with their number 7 curved turnouts. There's some more number 8s here as well. The 2 diamond crossings are a 14 degree and a 19 degree. Those will probably be supplied by me from the fast tracks range, although everything else on the entire standard gauge portion of the layout is standard Pico. He wanted to do that to save some money. Also in this corner he wanted to know if he could incorporate the Medusa cement industry. The main manufacturing portion of that industry is the Valley Cement on level 2, and the Medusa Cement kit is a satellite distribution centre owned by the same company. And it turned out that not only was I able to get that into this corner, but 2 additional industrial spurs as well. Now I showed them on the plan, but in the write-up that I sent him, I made sure he realised that they were optional. He didn't need to put them in. They just showed how he could fit them if he wanted them. And he wrote back and he said absolutely he definitely wanted them. He felt that the more industries I could get in, the better. I'm not quite sure what this industry is going to be. He had some ideas for something out of a science fiction movie, which I didn't fully understand. But the main gist is that we have 2 long spurs heading into the building, and underneath the helix, allowing for greater car capacity than it would appear. I've done the same thing with the lumberyard at the other end. And when I worked out the grades, I was indeed able to get these staging tracks underneath the helix. From this diamond crossing, which I regarded as the datum point, I had a 1% grade coming down, losing about 2 inches, and then gain another inch along this area at a 2% grade, have the grade almost nothing through the passing siding before beginning the helix grade at about this point here, and we can still end up with a full 4 inches of clearance between the 2 levels. And at the other end, the levels were not quite as critical because, as we can see, we've got most of the first lap of helix before we get over the top of the staging yard. And both staging yards are pretty much identical, although at this end there is an extra 4 inches of benchwork available, so these tracks are all 4 inches longer than their counterparts at the far end. So here is the middle deck completed. This area did not change very much. One of the things he requested was that the interchange yard extend under the wall cabinets to give us more length. Well, he asked if it was possible. I said yes, we can do that. I wanted to make sure that this deck was low enough for the main line to pass under the cabinets as well, because I wanted to move this junction a little further north to give me some more clearance. Even so, with the ruling grade running down from this turnout into the helix and a short upgrade into the industrial area, we still only have minimal clearance at this point. It's about 3.5 inches, so the end of this spur will have to be on thin benchwork. We've still got a full 4 inches of clearance by the time we get under the cement industry tracks. Oh, and I should probably mention at some point, with the 26-inch radius on the helix, the grade is a lot steeper than I would have liked. I normally use a 2% ruling gradient. I think this comes out at 2.6% if my memory serves me correctly. But with the relatively short trains and multi-unit lash-ups that he was thinking of running, that should not be an issue. The lumber mill turned out to have plenty of space for everything we wanted. We have a fairly long delivery track for the logs. A fairly narrow log pond is necessary. A decent length spur for shipping out finished lumber, and a shorter spur at the back for shipping out wood chips. Figure the waste products from here will probably go to a paper mill somewhere, represented by one of the staging yards. And then we have the 2-track engine house for servicing his short line locomotives. And we were both quite pleased at the way this scenic area turned out. In both cases, the water features have to be fairly close to track level, with only a few scale feet of clearance, otherwise we end up running out of benchwork depth. Although with the grade for the branch line starting right at this turnout, the trestle can be a little bit higher by the time it crosses over the stream. And then by the time it disappears into its own tunnel, it can be several inches higher. Here is the top deck with the scenery done. Note how the short line is shown as truncated. We're figuring that it was originally a branch owned by the same company as the Class 1 railroad represented on the 2 lower decks. But at some point it was truncated because it became less profitable, only being kept open this far because of the importance of the narrow gauge interchange. And by the transition period that the customer is representing, it has been taken over as a regional short line. I had to redesign this interchange because originally I thought he had side dump hoppers for his narrow gauge. It turns out that his hopper cars are bottom dump, so I needed a fairly long grade to a trestle over the top of the standard gauge track for transferring all from narrow to standard gauge hoppers. And the standard to narrow gauge interchange is basically 5 different industries in one. We've got the ore transfer, we have an oil transfer, we have a travelling crane, an end loader, and a double-sided loading dock. There's no end loader on the standard gauge. The rationale for that is that heavy equipment such as farm implements heading up the narrow gauge can be offloaded from the side of the standard gauge cars where the greater track gauge provides more stability, but they need to be end loaded onto the narrow gauge. At least that's the argument we're going to give. And I added a passenger station at the back of the narrow gauge because we're figuring that they're going to run a tourist train during the summer months. And that can show up once a session just to get in the way of the freight operations. Once again, he wanted minimal engine servicing facilities for the narrow gauge. We have 2 additional industries. We've got a coal trestle for a coal dealer and another industry which we haven't yet decided. You'll have plenty of time to decide what to put there by the time he builds the 3rd deck. And the idea of having a coal dealer up here is that some of the hoppers can now run loaded in both directions. And since the uphill coal traffic will be a lot lighter than the downhill ore traffic, the uphill trains will have both loaded and empty hoppers in the same train, adding a lot of interest. Notice how both the standard and narrow gauge in some cases has multiple spots on the same spurs. We were always going to be severely restricted as to how much track we could get in, how many spurs we could include. So we've maximised the operating potential out of each spur. And also the whole purpose of narrow gauge is to build it at minimal cost, so they wouldn't want to put in any more turnouts than they needed. Another change on this upper deck is to have the main line disappear into a tunnel. Not only does this give more room for the narrow gauge to come forward over the top of it, but it means that both narrow and standard gauge trains have a short section of waterside running. We both felt this would be beneficial for when he wants to photograph his trains. And then the narrow gauge just disappears around the back to a 3-track stub-end and staging yard. Once again, he'll have to back the trains out and turn them around between sessions on the visible portion of the layout. Well, anyway, I think that is about all there is to talk about with this layout design. Let me just go back and show you all 3 levels again, clean versions without being defaced by all the labels. Here is the lower deck. I don't know why Windows decided to mess up the coloration. It was fine for about half a second, and then it went crazy like this. Please feel free to pause on this level or any of the others. Here is the middle deck. And here is the upper deck. So I am just going to sign off at this point, bid you goodbye for this week, and I hope to see you again next week. Thanks for watching, and until next time, happy model railroading.